Joining me this week, all the way from Cairo, Egypt, is Oday Kamal. He is the founder of Zawda. Zawda is a Bitcoin custody company that's helping businesses in the Middle East and North Africa preserve Bitcoin wealth through multi-sig wallets. I've had the chance to talk offline with Oday. Fascinating story, fascinating background. So welcome to the show. I'm excited to talk to you.
Thanks, Natalie. It's great to be here.
Okay, let's start with your Bitcoin journey. I know that you have a really interesting backstory with the Lebanese banking crisis and sort of why Bitcoin is so important. But let's take it even further back than that. Tell us where you're from, your upbringing, and what sort of got you into this line of work.
Yeah, I am originally, as you said, from Lebanon. I've lived in 8 different countries, and I kind of had a very varied career across different industries and fields. Started off at Google in my first job out of grad school, then went to management consulting, and then in ride hailing with like Careem, which was the local version of Uber, and a very
Got
kind of like
acquired by Uber, right?
got acquired by Uber in 2018, and then a very random pivot to the United Nations in 2019, where I joined an agency called the World Food Program. It's the largest it's the largest humanitarian organization for food distribution around the world. So that was in Cairo at the time. Worked with them on setting up their innovation lab, and that was kind of like one of the jobs because of the fact that it's kind of more of a government-related job that allowed me to explore some of the other stuff that started my Bitcoin journey.
So tell us about that journey.
First time they learned about Bitcoin was a very long time ago, and everyone kind of has like their own origin story. There is the Lebanese banking crisis, which is when I first bought Bitcoin, but I first heard about it in 2012 when I was in grad school. My flatmate at the time was someone called Johnny Levin, the co-founder of Chainalysis, and he mentioned Bitcoin to me, which at the time sounded like magic internet money. It's just what it did, and he was writing a master's thesis on it. Obviously, Johnny went on to do a lot of amazing stuff. And Chainalysis now is kind of a global business. I even messaged him once we started Zawda. But that was the very, very first time that I heard about something called Bitcoin. And it kept kind of popping up through the different like ups and downs of the bull and bear market. The kind of like moment where I felt that this had changed was when in Lebanon in October 2019, there was an uprising. And that was kind of what took me on this journey for about like 4 to 5 months of discovering like what it is about money and value and how you preserve it that led me eventually to Bitcoin.
I just recently interviewed Tony Yazbak, who helped found the Bitcoin Way. He's also from Lebanon, and we talked about the crisis over there and how really it destroyed so many people's savings. Can you talk a little bit about your, memories or stories? I know that I think in Lynn's book, she talked about women holding up banks to try to get their own money, just like homemakers going up to a bank, people lighting them on fire. Can you talk a little bit about what all that was like?
Yeah. My personal experience with the Lebanese banking sector was driven out of kind of like necessity. As I mentioned to you, like I'd lived around the world, kind of like started my career abroad. And I'd always been driven by this fear that if I leave the country that I was working in, whether it was the United States or the UAE or Australia, I would lose my bank savings or the bank would shut me out and I would have no more residency. So out of kind of like safety, I would just say, I'll send it back home to Lebanon, put it in in the banking sector in US dollars and just forget about it. I was very risk averse, no equities, no nothing. I'm just going to leave US dollars in the bank, not knowing what's going to, and I thought I was being smart by spreading it across multiple bank accounts. And then on what started in Lebanon on the 17th of October 2019 was a popular uprising. So the government had announced that they want to introduce a WhatsApp tax for you to communicate and make phone calls. And then people started going to the streets. The whole country shut down. Banks were closed for 2 weeks. When they opened at the end of October, there was what we call like a bank run, because in the black market, you started noticing that the Lebanese pound was increasing compared to the one that the central bank had fixed. So the banks imposed capital controls. And for me, that was like the first moment where I said, all right, shit, the money's stuck. And what are we going to do with that? The stuff that you mentioned, like that Lynn talks about in that was like 6 to 12 months into the crisis, which got worse and worse. But the way that it started in October and November, as there was the popular uprising and a lot of the initial capital controls, where the currency had lost about 20 to 30% of its value, was that people were just standing in line for days on end, and you could withdraw like only $50 or $100 at a time. At the same time, and this became very clear, with the people that owned the banks and the politicians, the ruling class, it became evident that they had kind of taken money out of the system and
Yeah.
sent it to their Swiss bank accounts or abroad, which apparently afterwards, like, they were investigated for it. Even the central bank governor now, I think he's the only one in the world that's wanted by Interpol. That was how like everything started in that like autumn of 2019.
Coin Stories is brought to you by Bitdeer, where the power of Bitcoin mining is at your fingertips. As a publicly traded leader, Bitdeer's global reach and scale means they're everywhere you need them to be, ensuring you're part of the thriving Bitcoin economy. Bitdeer's not just mining, they are industry pioneers, and Bitdeer stands alone as the only vertically integrated, technology-focused Bitcoin mining company. What does that mean? Well, they're not just deploying, but developing the latest tech to make Bitcoin mining more efficient and effective. And with the industry's most experienced leadership team, innovation is in their DNA. And it shows. A quarter of their workforce is dedicated to research and development, pushing the boundaries of what's possible in Bitcoin mining. Now they're leveraging years of expertise in data center and cloud management into high performance computing through a recently announced partnership with NVIDIA. Join Bitdeer in reshaping the world of Bitcoin mining. Learn more at bitdeer.com and explore how they are pioneering the future today. So horrible to think about, like economic freedom for me, but not for thee. Well, so what's your journey to getting to Cairo, Egypt? Because Egypt has its own currency issues.
Yeah, I had October 2019 was so I got married, and then the revolution started in Lebanon, and I was supposed to move to Cairo to start this job with the United Nations. I had left Careem, it had been acquired by Uber, and I was looking for my next job. And the United Nations job with the World Food Program was based in Egypt.
Oh,
It's not a country that I'd been to before, but I'd never lived in. So I came in 2019 and decided to kind of like start my new married life here with my partner. Um, that was also a journey on its own because the first 6 months were like just starting our new life and a new job in a new city in a new country, and then COVID hits, and then going through that, and then up until like 2022, where Egypt goes through its own economic crisis,
yeah.
where again there's a whole dollar liquidity crisis where people can't access dollars, and the central bank kept the rate of the Egyptian pound pegged to the dollar for a good like 18 months. They just do these like controlled devaluations. Egypt is a very different case than Lebanon. You're talking about a country with a GDP of about $500 billion, approximately 105 million people. It's the largest country in the Middle East, and a lot of poverty as well. There's like 30 to 35% of the population that lives on less than $2 a day. So when you're talking about kind of an economic crisis in Egypt, it's really one of those cases when they talk about too big to fail. That crisis kind of like just went for most of like late 2022 to really only earlier this year when they got a bailout package from the UAE. It was about $35 billion to acquire a piece of land in on the north coast of Egypt.
Well, and again, shout out to Lynn because she exposes everything that's happening in Egypt, and I know about the currency issues from her work, but I guess I'm confused. So it must be difficult to operate a Bitcoin company there because I've also learned that it's not the adoption rate of Bitcoin is not very high, despite Egypt clearly being a place where you'd think that people would really need it.
Yeah. Egypt was our first target market when we launched the business. The government had issued a warning saying that any company that works with digital assets or cryptocurrencies will face kind of like legal repercussions, prison time, and fines. That really just sapped all the energy out of the system. There were a lot of like those usual like altcoin scams or any of those data breaches that were happening. There was one done by something called Hawkpool. It was, I think, about $6 million that were like stolen from people through like a Facebook page. And the government and central bank reiterated said anyone dealing with cryptocurrencies. At the same time, and that is something that I was doing, a lot of people were exchanging any of their Egyptian pounds into kind of like either USDT, into Bitcoin, using apps like Binance, and Binance like was still accessible here, using the black market rate, because that was the only way for them to just like take their money out of the system and put it in some kind of an asset that's hedged. So when we kind of like approached it here, we looked at Egypt as kind of a great example to kind of like try to alleviate that crisis, because we can try to create some liquidity by like making the black market obsolete and saying like, let's create kind of a peer-to-peer marketplace where people can exchange their EGPs for like Bitcoin or USDT. The problem we had is just that this is not something that the government really either understood or was a bit paranoid about. So we were like, told very deliberately, and I'll go into a bit more detail about how we started in Egypt. We were just told that like this is not something that the country is ready to adopt or do, even if they wanted to have full control over it. And then we just kind of were very politely rejected by the central bank and told to move on.
Wow. So, I mean, you mentioned so many people living in poverty. Can you share what your perspective is on can they adopt Bitcoin? How? Why? Because I sometimes get that question. Like, if someone is working and living paycheck to paycheck, they barely have any money. How can they put anything toward Bitcoin, especially given how volatile it is?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on kind of like where you are in the social classes, and there are different types of kind of like poverty. When you look at it, there are people that obviously are in abject poverty or extreme poverty. They're who's living on less than $2 a day. They're the ones that I would have interacted with at the UN when like you were giving out kind of cash-based transfers, and that was kind of part of the work that I did. And you can see like this is not usually the audience that is thinking about Bitcoin. They're just thinking about livelihood. It's kind
Yeah.
of like a Maslow hierarchy of needs. What you end up with is kind of like the lower to upper middle class, and plus kind of like what's above that, and that's kind of a population of about 50 to 60 million people that you can tap into. The way they think about it is what are some hard assets that don't lose value. So 20 years ago, one US dollar would buy you approximately 4 to 5 Egyptian pounds. Today, it's like 47. So you're talking about like kind of almost 10x depreciation in value. And what people usually put is they go for the typical hard asset classes. They go for real estate. Everyone like buys real estate in Egypt. That's kind of like across the different social classes. They would buy gold. Gold is very popular. They would buy the US dollar because it kind of maintains its fluctuation. And recently, like equities. The whole idea of what we were trying to do is pitch them like, well, you can add something else here to that column, which is Bitcoin. It's an asset. It's a hard asset. It preserves its value over time, and it has some of the better properties or a combination of some of those properties that allows you to kind of move it across time and space a bit better. What ended up happening is in 2017, during the bull market, Egypt was one of the highest adopter of cryptocurrencies. It wasn't necessarily Bitcoin, it's just crypto overall. And then in the report that came out in 2018, 2019, it said that Egypt is the highest country in the region that is adopting it. But when the
Oh,
central
really?
bank banned it, yeah, it was one of
Wow.
the countries that had the highest adoption rate. It came like, yeah, it was above Turkey, and then kind of it slipped back in the rankings. The
Oh.
problem was that when the central bank made this illegal, people were just like too scared to approach
Mm.
something like that. So they were like, we'll just stay away from it. Even though the volumes that you were seeing during the crisis between 2022 till like 2024, there was still a lot of like activity happening on the black market to exchange Egyptian pounds for Bitcoin and other assets.
Yeah, it's crazy to think. I mean, if you're going to go for hard, scarce assets to be able to acquire a home, you need so much in savings already. And even an ounce of gold, I mean, you need thousands of US dollars or and what's equivalent to that in other currencies. And for Bitcoin, you could have, any amount, any like small amount you could start allocating to Bitcoin. Okay, let's talk about Zawda. And how did you get around sort of this animosity from government actors and the central authorities being against companies like this coming up in the country?
Yeah, well, the whole idea started with what happened to me in Lebanon. So when the money was stuck in the bank, I decided to kind of I went on this kind of like my own journey of deciding like what is value, what is trust, how do you maintain like money as a medium of as a store of value and medium of exchange over time, given my personal experience, and I managed to redeem my savings at like a 60 to 75% loss, and that was in 2020 2021 when Bitcoin's price started rising. So you naturally start getting a lot of phone calls, people saying like, you're a genius, how did you figure that out? Managed to help like about 30 family and friends to do the same thing, and they managed to like put their savings out even though they lost it, but they invested it into Bitcoin. And that was like my only advice. I said, I'm putting it in Bitcoin. You guys can invest it in whatever altcoin you want, but I only kind of advocate for Bitcoin just because that's the only one I understand the most. Once I got to like that number and people were kind of like messaging me at the end of 2021, early 22, I said, maybe there's something to do with this. Maybe there's a business with it. Let's look into how you can move from just like helping people into like turning this into a business and understanding a bit more of the dynamics of this as an enterprise. The very first idea was how to do kind of a using the Lightning Network to transfer money for businesses across using Bitcoin. So we wanted to do like kind of Western Union, but for the region using the Lightning Network. And that was the idea that we initially pitched to the Wolf Accelerator when we went there in February 2023. But very quickly, as with any early stage startup, before you have your product market fit, you just got to like iterate on that stuff. And as I started talking to people like in Egypt and abroad, I said like, well, I'm going to help you kind of like not only acquire Bitcoin, but then you can kind of send money and not worry about the banks in that system. It just reverse engineered everything in our head, which said that instead of getting people to do 3 steps in advance, which is buy Bitcoin, store it, and then transfer it, convince them about buying Bitcoin. And that's where like most of our audience was. It's just like understanding Bitcoin as a store of value before it's a medium of exchange. Um, so that's when we started iterating throughout the accelerator on the idea that we have. The first product that we demoed on demo day was a way to help employees put part of their salary in Bitcoin. And that's what we went to the central bank with. And then we realized that actually we're not allowed to take employees' salaries and because of like tax repercussions. So now it's just about anyone that wants to put Bitcoin in self-custody using multi-sig. That's kind of like what we're helping. That's how we got to what we have today. And based off on like understanding where the market's at.
It's really fascinating. I've had the chance to talk to several founders who were part of the Wolf Accelerator in different cohorts. And I didn't realize that sometimes you come in with an idea and they back, you experimenting with that, and then it just doesn't work and you have to pivot, and maybe you have to pivot multiple times, but eventually, hopefully you land on something that really works and where you can drive value in the market. It's time for a quick break to hear these messages from my partners who make this podcast possible. Next up, Bitcoin 2024, the world's largest Bitcoin conference, is coming to Nashville this July. Join us for 3 amazing days of keynotes, panels, networking events, and my Women of Bitcoin brunch. Head to b.tc/conference and use the code HODL for 10% off. Next up, Speed Bitcoin Lightning Wallet, one of the fastest growing Bitcoin wallets out there. Speed is a secure, low-cost way to send and receive Bitcoin instantly. Download Speed using the QR code on the screen or the link in my show notes. Next up, Coinkite. Coinkite makes everything you need to safely self-custody your Bitcoin, including the Coldcard wallet. That's the cold storage device I use for safekeeping my Bitcoin. Head to their site in my show notes and get a 5% discount with promo code CoinStories. And finally, the why of Bitcoin is easy to grasp, but the how can be so confusing. The Bitcoin Way is a professional Bitcoin IT and security team offering personalized one-on-one support that guides you through cold storage, setting up nodes, inheritance planning, privacy best practices, and more. Set up your free 30-minute consultation today. All right, back to the show. When it comes to onboarding companies with multi-sig, 2 questions. Number 1, what kind of companies are you really working with right now in the Middle East and in North Africa? Are you onboarding a lot of smaller companies, or are you trying to go for the big corporations? And why do you feel that multi-sig and essentially self-custody is so important?
So to answer the first part of the question, the type of companies and clients that we're getting the most traction from are people that are naturally in that space. So they're like exchanges or brokers that are branching out into digital assets. They're the ones that are looking for a way to not like leave the money there and just find a way to kind of safeguard it a bit better. Mm-hmm. We also, from the conversation we had early on, had some interest from small businesses that just have a lot of cash in a currency that's depreciating that want to put it into Bitcoin. And family offices for like small amounts. We're talking about less than 5% of their portfolio. Usually it's 1%. The problem for them was, and the problem that we're trying to solve when we're looking at multi-sig, is that those companies are trying to escape from like stuff that happened to me and to kind of like a lot of other people in Lebanon and in Egypt and in Turkey and in a lot of other emerging economies where like you're suffering from like high inflation, a currency devaluation, or capital controls. At the same time, you have an asset like Bitcoin that is kind of nascent and like that's a scarce asset that you're very interested in and that you want to put some money into just to kind of like be part of that journey. But you're scared about saying like, oh yeah, I'm just going to buy on like Binance, and then all I'm going to get is that seed phrase or that login. So if I'm putting like big amounts, is that all I have? For a lot of the companies and institutions we talk to, they're like, is there something more secure? Is there something that allows us to make sure that if you go under, if you are you going to steal my money, or if like something, or if another hack or data breach happens, how can I make sure that nothing happens to the amount of money that I'm going to invest with you? And we're talking about big amounts here. And for us, multisig was the answer because ultimately it gives you no single point of failure, and it retains control for the kind of user over their Bitcoin. So as Zawda will only have access to 1 out of the 3 keys, the client will maintain the 2 keys, and they can kind of distribute it any way they want. If they lose one, they can contact us. We can go back, create a new wallet, and they have access to 2 private keys again, and we'll have the 3rd one. But the idea is just to always maintain 2 keys at any point in time.
So you're also having to deal with, I mean, all these different central banks in different nations in that region, right? Because some of them have custodial licenses. What's that process been like? Because I would imagine each nation is very different and unique.
Yeah, that's the difficulty of working in a market like the Middle East. It's like very fragmented, even though it's like a massive, it's like twice the size of the US in population wise, but because you have about 16 countries, everyone have their own jurisdiction and their own laws. So we started with Egypt because this is where I was most familiar and where we had the most contacts with like senior officials. After we got rejected on the 24th of December, I was asking some feedback from other founders in the fintech space on like how to go about this. At the time, there was a co-founder of an Egyptian startup called Thunder. They had been licensed by the Egyptian Central Bank, and they were looking to expand in the GCC in the Gulf. For the co-founder, they're safe. He told me like before you kind of like stop it, like decide what you want to do next, talk to the central bank in Bahrain. They're the first central bank to have issued regulation around cryptocurrencies back in 2018, and they seem to kind of have a very more pro approach to adopting it. So look into them, talk to their team, and see what can happen. So we did that early on in this year. We started having conversations with the central bank there. We had their FDI team that was like really interested in just positioning Bahrain as kind of a hub for cryptocurrencies, and they've already had a few kind of businesses set up there. So we submitted an application in April, and now we're like for a custodial application, and we're waiting to hear back from them. We're having these like kind of back and forth. I'll be going there later this month to just speak with them. But they were the ones that seemed the most kind of like understanding, and it was a very different interaction than what we had with kind of Egypt. The other kind of like jurisdiction that does exist and that has cryptocurrencies is the UAE with like Abu Dhabi and Dubai.
Yeah, I've heard that, the UAE is very friendly to digital assets. Is it true that America sort of sets the tone when it comes to regulatory decisions? Like if they come out with something that's very pro Bitcoin, other countries follow suit? Or do you see fragmentation there too, where other countries are really taking a very different stance than the United States, or maybe they're ahead of where we are in terms of how they look at this industry?
I think it doesn't know the US doesn't dictate a lot of that, even though the trends for like retail institutions are further ahead in the US, if that makes sense. So legally, what you see happening in countries like Bahrain and the UAE is a bit further ahead than where the US is in terms of like the free zones they've established, the laws and regulation, the rules and requirements for you to set up a business and all of that. Like it's a bit more friendly for digital assets and cryptocurrencies in general. Even they're also like starting to appreciate Bitcoin as a separate kind of like asset class. So like that's happening. The thing right now is for a small startup versus kind of a big business, like you really need a lot of capital requirements to be able to do that because they want to protect the retailer, they want to protect the consumer. So it's just about trying to understand how you want to navigate that. But I find that they've kind of tried to position themselves strategically in that space because they wanted to attract a lot of that. And you can see it working to their advantage. I think the UAE has one of the highest rates of adoption for digital assets around the world. It's like about 25 or 30% of the population has it.
Yeah, and favorable taxes. I know a lot of people have moved over there because no income tax, I think, right? So I have a
You pay it
question.
in different ways. I've lived there, and it's you don't pay income tax, but there are different kinds of taxes that you pay.
Oh, for sure, for sure. And it's funny because it's a lot of surveillance, and I don't know. It's interesting to see some of the hardcore Bitcoiners really passionate about living in places where it is a lot more authoritarian, but in some ways you do have more freedom, more economic freedom. I wanted to ask you, so I've discussed the topic on my show several times of just the idea of like the forces of freedom being Bitcoin versus the forces of control, the government, the regulators, and there being a little bit of a battle and some friction, especially in the years ahead. And a lot of people comment on that. People have very passionate takes. What do you see as far as that? Do you think that there's going to be a lot of pushback? Do you think that that's easing, especially with the legitimization of Bitcoin? We have, ETF products around the world now. More people are recognizing the difference between Bitcoin and crypto. And how do we get sort of more global adoption, especially in places that clearly need it most?
Yeah. I think you're definitely seeing the separation between Bitcoin and crypto happen. And here it's starting to kind of like catch on. But the kind of like the personal experience that I had was I was working at the UN while at the same time setting up this kind of like startup that is like Bitcoin only and looking to kind of increase adoption of Bitcoin. So during the daytime, I was in this very bureaucratic rules and regulation environment, following specific protocols on how stuff needs to be done. And in the afternoon and evening, it's all about like how can you be at the cutting edge of what like the future of finance is going to be like, and kind of giving people full authority over their Bitcoin and like as a store of value, and allowing them to become like self-sovereign individuals. So kind of like living in that contrast was very interesting because there was no middle ground, and you could see kind of like the two worlds. In my opinion, what I think is happening is, this is just kind of like a hypothesis that I have, is that we're seeing right now a breakdown of a lot of the institutions that came out of like 1945 and that world order after World War II. So they're kind of like having to buckle down with all the bureaucracy, with a lot of the rules that they've had to kind of like amass over those like decades. And they're not being able to adapt to this age of like machinery, AI, like Bitcoin, like decentralization. They're having to kind of like wrestle with that when they have all of that like baggage that they're kind of hauling with them. At the same time, you have this emerging one, which is something like Bitcoin, that's like a $1 trillion plus asset now. I mean, it has a bigger market cap than like most of the like, well, only 15 countries have a bigger circulation value than like Bitcoin. It is something that has teeth, and it is something that is valuable.
Mhm.
So what we're going to look now is just a matter of like how fast these things happen. Like as we see that breakdown in that kind of like 1945 or post 1945 world order, what is the new world order going to look like, and how is that going to like translate? I think with the stuff that we've seen over the past 2 years in terms of like politics, it
Mhm.
does seem like we're moving into kind of a more polarized world. So this is where stuff like Bitcoin and hard assets flourish. And I think this is where we can kind of see a lot of these things too. So for us, this is an opportunity to just say, like, how can we make sure as many people as possible, like, don't lose any of their savings, they don't lose any of their wealth, they just find a way to preserve it, because throughout history and throughout time, like you've noticed that the average person really doesn't have any means to do that, whether they like saved in like paper, like banknotes, whether in like coins. Like you hear about these stories all around the world from different people. Right now, I think there is a new opportunity with the internet, with Bitcoin, to do that, and something that would benefit a higher number of people.
What's it going to take for another nation to adopt Bitcoin like El Salvador? And what country do you think it will be?
Um, I wouldn't rule out a Middle Eastern country, but that's just because I'm biased and in the region. I think that what it's going to take is, you already have countries that are mining Bitcoin. Like they are, and I'll speak about kind of like, you have the UAE and Abu Dhabi is mining Bitcoin. They have
Yeah.
a partnership with uh, um, Manhattan Digital Group, like the miners, and and you have Oman, who's established like a whole Bitcoin oasis. So they're using kind of like renewable energy to do that. So I
And
already think that,
Bhutan.
and Bhutan as well as doing it. So is Iceland. But what we're seeing right now is kind of people waiting to see like what other countries are going to do. And I think what we'll end up seeing is a country that probably a bit bigger than the size of Salvador, but not like a massive country try to go for it.
Yeah.
Like it's a country that's either going to try to attract attention to it, or going to try to do something creative with Bitcoin, whether how you mine it or whether how like you want to create some rules and regulation around it. I would love to see a country in that part of the world do it, but that's wait to be seen.
Is your plan to try to go back to Lebanon?
No, Lebanon is a tiny country of 4.5 million people, and it's got a massive diaspora. About
Mhm.
14 million people live outside the country. So it's a tiny market, and it kind of like
Oh,
adapts. Like it's been through a lot of like economic and political crisis in my lifetime,
yeah.
in my parents' lifetime, in my grandparents' lifetime. So it's
Yeah.
just going to exist, and it's in a very, the kind of like economic and political stability just doesn't exist there. The priority we have right now is to get that custody license from Bahrain, and to start
Mhm.
onboarding partners, and mostly kind of like large businesses and other exchanges in the GCC and in Egypt. These would be kind of like our key markets. And from there on, to start like branching out to like nearby regions. If I want to kind of tell you like what does kind of this look like ideally in like 5 to 10 years time, would be kind of like
Yeah.
doing a lot of collaborative custody with some of the successful companies in this space. And we're providing this kind of like assurance for businesses around the world. And we're like part of that global network that kind of uses multi-sig to custody Bitcoin for everyone.
It would be amazing. Fascinating work. Anything else that you want to share before we start to wrap up?
Nothing. I just want to say that for us, the really thing that changed it from like kind of having a small startup to kind of a business today and where we are was really like just being able to go to something like Wolf. And I really want to give them credit, because when you're sitting down kind of like in Cairo, far away from all those people that are in that space, whether it's like people like you or others that are in this, like Lynn that we mentioned, or all the others that really you follow online and that you see their work, being at something like Wolf just allows you to have much easier access to that. And for me, that was really the stuff that took us from like just a concept idea to like a business that's now trying to find the product market fit and try to iterate on it. Not only just like the pivoting, but just being exposed to those people and being able to talk to them. Because instead of just having someone that you can like DM on Twitter, you'd be able to just like have those conversations and meet with them and have those like kind of one-to-ones. So for me, this was really what kind of moved this from just another concept or another idea that I had outside of work to something that I'm working and dedicating my life to.
Yeah, the team at Wolf is incredible, and really, especially at an early stage, people need mentorship and guidance, and to be around one another to collaborate and like bounce ideas back and forth. And they've brought together people from literally all over the world. It's been amazing to see. So it's fantastic to connect with someone else who's been a part of Wolf. This has been so fascinating, and I've had the chance to visit Cairo once. I visited Cairo and Sharm el Sheikh. Beautiful country, fascinating history. I've always been fascinated by Egyptian history, and I really hope that it becomes a Bitcoin nation. And your work is amazing. So, Oday, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you so much for checking out this episode of Coin Stories. If you're listening on the Fountain app, you can show your support and share your thoughts by sending a boost. Last month's top episode was with Michael Saylor at Michael E. Sparks, boosted 777 sats and said, "We're still early." Another popular episode was with Ed Dowd at Justin Affronti, boosted 500 sats and said, "Paul Ryan actively talking about US CBDCs, and some folks think it won't happen in our lifetime. Gradually, then suddenly." Great job, Natalie and Ed. Thanks so much, Justin. I love reading and replying to your boosts, so download Fountain on iOS or Android today and make sure you're subscribed to Coin Stories. This show is for entertainment and educational purposes only. Nothing should constitute as official investment advice, and you should always do your own research. My inbox is open if you want to share feedback or guest suggestions. Just reach out at Natalie@talkingbitcoin.com. I'll see you next time.